Christmas Eve, mail-order bride slept hungry by the fire pit until the cowboy said, "Get up, you're coming home." Wyoming Territory, Christmas Eve, 1889. The snow fell heavy and steady, swirling like ash in the dark. It was a violent, suffocating white that erased the horizon and turned the world into a blur of ice and wind. The cold here was not merely a temperature, it was a living, predatory thing that hunted the unprepared, seeking out gaps in coats and weaknesses in spirits. Eleanor Moore was painfully, recklessly unprepared. She huddled in the narrow, refuse-strewn alley behind the town's only inn, her back pressed against the rough-hewn timber wall. The fire pit before her was a mockery, its embers having long ago surrendered to the snow, leaving only a bed of damp, grey ash. She wore a dress of thin lilac silk, a garment designed for the climate of a parlour in Savannah, not a blizzard in the territories. The fabric, once meant to charm a suitor, now clung to her shivering frame like a wet shroud. Her stomach twisted, a hard knot of pain that had moved beyond hunger into a dull, rhythmic cramping. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, not since the last scraps of bread on the train, and the hollowness inside her felt vast enough to echo the howling wind. Eleanor clutched her carpetbag, her knuckles white against the torn leather handle. It was the only tether she had left to a life that made sense, though the contents were meager. Her purse had been cut from her wrist on the train platform in Omaha, vanished into a crowd of pushing elbows and shouting porters, taking her last few dollars with it. Yet, despite the gnawing emptiness in her belly and the numbness creeping into her toes, she refused to move toward the inn's front door. She had already tried. The landlady, a woman with eyes as hard as flint, had taken one look at Eleanor's disheveled state and lack of coin, and had slammed the heavy oak door, sliding the bolt home with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. Eleanor would not beg. She would not scratch at the wood like a dog wanting to be let in. She had come west with a contract, a promise of marriage to a man named Edward, a promise of a home. Instead, Edward had taken one look at her on the platform, frail, exhausted, travel-worn, and declared her unsuitable. She was a package returned to sender, only there was no sender to go back to. She was simply discarded debris on the edge of the frontier. The crunch of heavy boots on snow broke her trance. It was a wet, rhythmic trudging that signaled weight and intent. Eleanor lifted her head, her neck stiff with cold. A man stumbled into the mouth of the alley, the stench of cheap whiskey rolling off him in waves that overpowered the clean scent of snow. He was large, his coat unbuttoned despite the freezing temperature, and he grinned when he saw her, a flash of yellow teeth in the gloom. "Well now," he slurred, bracing a hand against the brick wall to steady himself. "Aren't you a little present from Santa?" Eleanor stiffened, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. A second shadow detached itself from the street lamp's glow and joined him. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the second man, the marriage broker. The very man who had taken her fee, arranged her travel, and then stood by silently while Edward rejected her. He looked at her now with a sneer of contempt, as if her shivering form was an insult to his business reputation. "Look at that," the broker spat. "Knew she'd end up here. Guess the groom didn't want damaged goods." The drunk laughed, a low, wet sound. "Figure someone ought to get some use out of her." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, the movement making her light-headed. The world tilted on its axis, grey spots dancing in her vision, but she forced her legs to hold her weight. She backed away until her shoulder blades hit the icy wood of the inn. "Stay back," she rasped, though her voice was brittle, stripped of power by the cold. The drunk stepped closer, ignoring her warning. "Don't make a fuss, sweetheart. Cold night. We can keep each other warm." He reached out, his hand grasping for her arm. Eleanor swung her bag between them, a pitiful shield, trembling not just from the temperature now, but from a primal, rising panic. She closed her eyes, bracing for the grab, for the fall. "You do not get to fall," she told herself fiercely. "Not tonight. Not while you are still breathing." Then a new sound cut through the wind, the heavy rhythmic clatter of a wagon and the snort of a horse. A voice, low and resonant, rolled down the alley like thunder. "You have somewhere else to be." It wasn't a question. The drunk froze, his hand inches from Eleanor's sleeve. He turned slowly. Standing at the alley's entrance was a figure that seemed carved from the mountain itself. The newcomer was tall, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh snow, his face obscured by the brim of a Stetson. He didn't posture or shout. He simply stood there with a stillness that was far more terrifying than aggression. The broker, sensing a shift in the hierarchy of violence, took a half-step back. "We were just going," the broker stammered. The stranger didn't blink. He just waited. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the drunk grunted, dropped his hand and shuffled away, the broker scurrying after him like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. When they were gone, the man turned his attention to Eleanor. He moved closer, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face, a days-old beard, eyes that were dark and unreadable, and a mouth set in a grim line. He didn't look at her with pity, which she would have hated, nor with desire, which she feared. He looked at her with assessment. "Is there anyone waiting for you?" he asked. The question hung in the frosty air. Eleanor felt a sudden stinging burn behind her eyes. No one had asked her that. Not the conductor, not the broker, not the man she was supposed to marry. She shook her head, a singular, jerky movement. Without a word, the man unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. He slid it off his shoulders and stepped forward, draping it around her. The warmth of the garment was immediate, heavy and smelling of wood smoke and horses, shocking her frozen skin. "Get up," he said, his voice dropping an octave, gentler now. "You're coming home." He led her to a wagon parked on the main street. It was a sturdy utilitarian thing, covered by a canvas tarp. As he helped her up to the wooden bench, Eleanor glanced back into the wagon bed. Nestled under a pile of thick patchwork quilts were 4 children. They watched her with wide, solemn eyes, silent as ghosts. One yawned, a small puff of steam escaping rosy lips. Another blinked slowly, fighting sleep. Eleanor turned back to the man. Caleb, she would later learn, bewildered. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses lurched forward, pulling them away from the alley, away from the town, and into the vast, consuming dark of the prairie. For a long time, the only sound was the crunch of wheels on snow and the wind whistling through the bare branches of cottonwood trees. Eleanor stared straight ahead, afraid that if she looked at him or the children, the mirage would shatter. "He said I would not do," Eleanor murmured finally, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The silence had become too loud, and she needed to fill it to prove she was still real. "The man who ordered me. He said I was not the right kind of woman to raise boys. Too quiet, not sturdy enough." She gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded like cracking ice. "Then he sent me away. On Christmas Eve." Behind them, the canvas rustled. A boy's voice, clear and strikingly mature, pierced the air. "Do you have someone to protect you?" Eleanor turned. A boy of about 10 with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much stared back at her. His gaze was not hostile, but clinical. Eleanor's throat tightened. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled over, freezing on her cheeks. "No," she whispered, "I do not." Caleb kept his eyes on the road, his profile rigid, but his grip on the reins tightened. "Around here," Caleb said, his voice rough gravel, "children are not chosen, they are kept." The ranch house appeared out of the gloom like a beacon, a low, sturdy structure made of timber and stone, tucked beneath the shelter of a ridge. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, painting a grey streak against the black sky. Caleb stopped the wagon and hopped down. He moved with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, lifting a sleeping toddler from the wagon bed into the crook of his arm before offering a hand to Eleanor. Her legs were stiff, her knees buckling as she hit the ground, but he steadied her, his grip firm. They entered the house, and the wall of warmth that hit Eleanor almost brought her to her knees again. It smelled of pine resin, burning oak, and a savory broth that made her mouth water instantly. The interior was simple, but cared for. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting dancing orange shadows across rough-hewn furniture. The children filed in behind them. Eleanor stood by the door, unsure of her place, dripping melting snow onto the floorboards. The 4 children turned to look at her. Thomas, the oldest, stood protectively in front of the others. Eli, perhaps 7, hovered near the door as if checking for an escape route. Martha, a girl of 5 with tangled hair, peeked from behind a chair, and Jonah, the toddler in Caleb's arms, whimpered softly, burying his face in the man's coat. Caleb didn't issue orders. He simply guided Eleanor to a bench near the fire. "Sit," he said. He went to the pot hanging over the fire and ladled soup into a tin bowl. He handed it to her first. Eleanor took it, her hand shaking so violently the spoon clattered against the rim. The broth was thin, mostly water and potatoes, but as she swallowed the first spoonful, it tasted like salvation. She watched the family as she ate. They moved with a synchronized quietness that was unnatural for children. There was no shouting, no playing, no chaos. They were like little soldiers in a war she didn't understand. Thomas fetched wood without being asked. Eli sat at the table but didn't eat until Caleb sat down. Martha broke her bread into tiny pieces, feeding half to Jonah, who was nodding off in his high chair. Eleanor noticed a pair of boots drying near the stove. They were small, well-worn and scuffed, clearly belonging to Thomas. Unlike the other children's clothes, which were patched and mismatched, Thomas's coat and boots fit him perfectly. They were old, but they were originally his. Eleanor lowered her spoon, a realization dawning on her. She looked at Caleb, who was wiping Jonah's face with a tenderness that belied his rugged appearance. "The oldest," Eleanor said softly, her voice raspy from disuse. "He is your real son, isn't he?" The room went still. Thomas didn't look up from his bowl, but his spoon stopped moving. Caleb slowly turned his gaze from the fire to Eleanor. The flames reflected in his dark eyes, illuminating a depth of sorrow she hadn't noticed before. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the 3 younger children, the strays he had evidently collected, much like he had collected her. Then his eyes rested on Thomas. "He is the only one," Caleb said, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire, "who never had to ask if I was coming back." Eleanor looked down at her empty bowl, the weight of his words settling over her. She was in a house of broken things, of cast-offs and leftovers, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel like a failure for being one of them. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Eleanor woke to the faint, earthy scent of cornmeal browning in a skillet and the sharp bite of wood smoke. The cabin was dim, illuminated only by the grey morning light filtering through frosted window panes and the low, steady glow of the hearth. For a moment, disoriented by the warmth and the weight of the wool blanket tucked securely around her shoulders, she forgot where she was. Then the memories of the snow, the alley, and the silent wagon ride rushed back. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the cold of the previous night. Laughter, light and suppressed, trickled in from the kitchen area. She stepped out of the small alcove where she had slept to find Caleb already awake. He was crouched near the cast-iron stove, turning something golden in a heavy pan. He wore the same shirt as the night before, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with work, his presence filling the small room not with noise, but with a steady, grounding gravity. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble, not turning his head. Eleanor murmured a soft reply, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as if it were armor. Across the room the children were already awake and occupied, but the scene was unnervingly quiet. It was a hushed, careful kind of play, as if they all understood that peace was fragile and loud noises might shatter it. Thomas was stacking small, rough-cut wooden blocks near the wall, his movements precise and deliberate. Martha sat curled in a rocking chair with a doll made of rags and buttons, whispering secrets to it. Eli was at the frosted window, tracing patterns on the glass with one finger, while Jonah toddled around with one sock half off, mumbling in a language only he understood. Eleanor felt a surge of uselessness. She moved toward the stove, spotting a pot bubbling on the edge. Instinctively, she reached out to lift it, to prove her worth, to do something. But Thomas was there in an instant. "I got it," the boy said simply, stepping between her and the stove. He used a thick rag to shift the pot to a warmer spot. Eleanor stepped back, stung. She turned to the floor. Surely it needed sweeping. But Eli was already there, dragging a broom twice his size with surprising efficiency. She looked at the table. Martha had already set the spoons and napkins. There was nothing for her to do. She was a guest in a machine that ran perfectly without her. Caleb looked up from the skillet, his dark eyes catching the slump in her shoulders. He saw the way she held herself, rigid, brittle, like a wall trying desperately not to collapse. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked past her, opening the heavy front door. The cold air rushed in, biting and crisp. He didn't ask her to follow, he just paused, leaving the door slightly ajar, an invitation rather than a command. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped out onto the porch. The world was blindingly white, the storm having left a fresh, thick coat of snow over the valley. Caleb picked up a pair of thick leather work gloves from a crate and held them out to her. "Applewood makes the best fire for cornbread," he said casually, looking out at the tree line. "Nobody has ever roasted corn over it quite like Eleanor Moore. At least I am guessing." She blinked at him, confused by the sudden specificity of the compliment, then realized what he was doing. He wasn't asking for help. He was offering her a place. Her hands shook as she took the gloves. They walked in silence to the woodpile by the barn, half buried in a drift. Caleb handed her a small axe, not a heavy splitting maul, but a hatchet meant for kindling. "I am not very good at this," she admitted, her voice trembling. Caleb shrugged, leaning against a fence post. "Neither was I. Once." And then he did the most terrifying thing of all. He walked away. He left her there, not as a dismissal, but because he knew she needed to stand on her own feet without an audience. The gloves were stiff and scratched her wrists. The wind tugged at her thin dress. But Eleanor set a log on the stump and swung. The blade bit into the wood with a satisfying thwack. She swung again and again. Her form was clumsy, but her back stayed straight. 10 minutes in, the tears finally came. They weren't the panicked tears of the alley. They were deep, heaving sobs of release. She cried for the hunger, for the humiliation on the train platform, for the years of being told she was too quiet, too weak, too unwanted. She cried until her arms burned and the woodpile had grown by a dozen pieces. She was leaning against the barn wall, wiping her face with the back of a glove, when the barn door creaked. Martha patted out into the snow, holding a tin plate with both hands. On it sat a steaming slice of cornbread, golden and crusty. "I saved you the corner piece," the little girl said, her eyes wide and earnest. "It is the best part." Eleanor dropped to her knees in the snow, indifferent to the cold soaking her hem. She took the plate with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Martha smiled, a small, shy expression that lit up her face, and then ran back inside. Eleanor bit into the bread. It was hot, slightly sweet and gritty with cornmeal. It tasted like home. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. She didn't need to be perfect to be here. She just needed to stay. And for the first time in her life, someone had actually asked her to. Later that afternoon, the sky turned a dull, pewter grey, threatening more snow. Eleanor was near the fence line, pinning a damp cloth to a rope string, when the sound of hooves cut through the silence. Her blood ran cold. 2 riders were approaching the ranch, their horses cutting through the snow with the slow arrogance of men who believe they own the road. She recognized them instantly. The man in front was Edward, the fiancé who had rejected her. He wore a fine wool coat and clean leather gloves, looking every bit the prosperous landowner he claimed to be. Behind him rode the marriage broker, looking miserable and cold. Edward dismounted first, his boots polished, his expression one of practiced concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I came to bring you back. I should not have turned you away like I did." He took a step closer. "I was overwhelmed. I wasn't ready. But I've had time to think. You deserve better than being stranded out here with a squatter." The broker dismounted, shivering, and brushed snow off his sleeves. "You signed a contract, Miss Moore," he added sharply, his voice nasally and irritating. "You were promised to Mr. Edward. You are in breach if you do not return." Eleanor backed up against the fence, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She started, but the words died in her throat. Old habits of submission were hard to break. Then the barn door creaked open. Caleb stepped out. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He simply walked forward, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag, and stopped beside Eleanor. He stood a little in front of her, not blocking her view, but placing himself between her and the men. He carried no gun, but the sheer size of him, combined with the lethal calm in his eyes, made the broker take a nervous step back. Caleb didn't look at Eleanor. His gaze was fixed on Edward. "What does she owe you?" Caleb asked. The tone wasn't a challenge. It was a quiet inquiry that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Edward shifted uncomfortably, puffing out his chest in a vain attempt to match Caleb's presence. "She is spoken for. We have paperwork. I paid her passage." Caleb tilted his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "She walked through snow on Christmas Eve," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "With no coat, no food, no place to go. You closed your door." He let the words hang in the freezing air, heavy and shaming. "She does not owe you a damn thing." Edward opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. He looked past Caleb toward the house. In the window, 4 small faces were pressed against the glass. Thomas, Eli, Martha, and even little Jonah watched with unblinking intensity. It was a silent jury. Edward saw the protective wall Caleb had built, not just of wood and stone, but of will. He saw the way Eleanor stood, still afraid, yes, but stepping closer to Caleb, not away. "Let's go," Edward muttered, his bravado collapsing under the weight of Caleb's stare. He turned and mounted his horse, not daring to look Eleanor in the eye again. The broker scrambled to follow, muttering about lost fees and ungrateful women. They rode off, their figures quickly swallowed by the grey horizon and the falling snow. Eleanor stood still, her breath hitching in her chest. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her shaking. Caleb finally turned to her. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer empty comforts. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and grounding, acknowledging the victory. "Are you all right?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the retreating figures, then back at the man who had stood between her and the past. She nodded, a newfound strength settling in her spine. "Yes," she said, and this time her voice did not tremble. "I believe I am." The days passed, unannounced and quiet, the way winter settles into the timber of a house until it becomes part of the architecture. In the small ranch house tucked beneath the snow-capped hills, Eleanor ceased to be a guest and became something else, essential, like the mortar between stones. She mended a torn hem on Martha's dress using scraps from a sack of old fabric she found in the pantry. Her stitches were uneven, her hands still trembling slightly from years of anxiety rather than cold. But when she finished, Martha grinned as if the patchwork was spun from gold. "Thank you," the little girl whispered, hugging Eleanor around the waist without asking. Eleanor froze at first, her arms hovering in the air, a reflex born of a lifetime of being untouched. Then slowly she lowered them, wrapping the child in an embrace that surprised her with its fierce protectiveness. Later that week, she sat beside Eli near the hearth, a tattered picture book in her lap. She read aloud, stumbling now and then over words smudged by grease or time. When she halted mid-sentence, embarrassed by her error, Eli didn't mock her. He simply looked up, his head resting heavily on her shoulder, and said softly, "You do not have to be perfect. Just keep reading." She smiled through a sudden blur of tears and turned the page. With Jonah, the bond was simpler, primal. He began reaching for her without thought, his tiny, sticky hands grasping at her skirt, his breath warm on her neck when she hoisted him onto her hip. When he napped against her chest in the afternoons, she stayed still for hours, afraid to move and break the spell of being needed. But with Thomas, the trust was harder won. He watched her from a distance, measuring her not by her words, but by what she endured. He saw her shake snow off the heavy blankets, pull blistering hot bread from the fire without complaint, and rub down Caleb's horse when the wind was howling loud enough to spook the livestock. She never asked for permission to work, and Caleb never stopped her. Healing, she realized, did not come in grand declarations or lightning strikes. It came in small, steady hours. One evening, after the dishes were cleared, Thomas sat on the floor while Eleanor gently brushed his hair. The brush had belonged to his mother, the bristles worn but soft. He didn't squirm. He sat stone still, gazing into the fire. Then, without turning, he asked, "Are you going to stay forever?" Eleanor's hand paused mid-stroke. She looked toward Caleb, who was whittling a block of pine at the table. He didn't raise his head, but his knife stopped moving. "I would like to," she said quietly. "If you all would let me." Thomas nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, folded square of fabric. It was an old handkerchief, frayed at the edges, the white cotton yellowed with age. "My ma gave me this when I was little," he said, his voice tight. "She said to keep it for when I missed her." He held it out to Eleanor, not with ceremony, but with a solemnity that aged him 10 years. "I think maybe you should have it now." Eleanor took the cloth with trembling fingers. The fabric was soft, worn thin by the worry of a little boy's hands, and it carried the weight of a permission she hadn't dared to hope for. It wasn't a boy asking for a mother. It was a boy telling her she had become one. She pressed the cloth to her lips, unable to speak. Behind them, Caleb finally turned back to his carving, a small, barely there smile touching the corner of his mouth. It wasn't pride exactly, nor relief. It was the look of a man watching a wound finally begin to close. Outside, the wind kicked up fresh snow across the hills, but inside the walls, something else had settled, a peace that felt sturdy enough to hold up the roof. Weeks later, the wind was already shifting when they finished loading the wagon for a supply run. Caleb fastened the last sack of oats with steady hands, tugging the ropes tight. Eleanor stood beside him, her arms red from the cold, her sleeves dusted with flour and snow. "You sure the horses can pull this much?" she asked, eyeing the heavy load of wool bundles and preserved fruit. He gave a slow nod. "They have before." She smiled faintly, climbing up to the bench. "So have I." They rode in silence, the wagon creaking down the trail toward town. But the weather in the Wyoming Territory was a fickle beast. The snow came sooner than the sky had promised, thick, heavy flakes that stuck fast and swallowed sound. Within an hour, the path vanished under a carpet of white. The wagon lurched, wheels spinning in slush, then stopped altogether. "Too deep," Caleb muttered. Eleanor stepped down, the snow instantly rising above her boots. "What now?" Caleb pointed toward a rock formation, a shallow cave half hidden under a ridge. They led the horses to shelter first, then carried in what they could: a lantern, a blanket, a pack of food. Inside the cave, the cold was still sharp, but the wind was cut off. Caleb built a small fire from kindling tucked under the wagon seat. Eleanor sat with her back to the stone wall, arms wrapped tight around her body to stop the shivering. "You are cold," he said. "I am fine," she lied. He didn't argue. He shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched, remembering the alley. "You do not have to. You will freeze." He sat beside her, close enough to share warmth, but careful not to crowd her. "I do not leave people cold in the snow," he said. "You said the same thing that night," she whispered. The fire crackled between them, illuminating his face. He looked tired, but not worn down, strong, but not hard. "I still do not know if I can be a mother," she confessed to the flames. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and unsure, stripping away the certainty he usually wore like armor. "I do not know how to ask a woman to marry me," he said. "I have no ring. I have no pretty words. I have a house full of children and not much else." He looked at her then. "But if you are still sitting here come morning, then the house is yours too." 1 year later, the ranch no longer felt like a fortress bracing against the world. It breathed. Warmth spilled from the kitchen, laughter echoed through the halls, and firelight danced in every window. Outside, the snow fell in soft, patient sheets, but inside, it was Christmas. Eleanor sat by the hearth, knitting needles clicking gently as a red scarf took shape. Thomas moved around the dining table, arranging plates with the fastidious care of a head waiter. He was taller now, his shoulders broadening, his confidence solid. Eli and Martha were giggling in the corner, hanging strings of dried fruit and pine cones on a crooked fir tree. And Jonah, sweet, clumsy Jonah, sat in the middle of the rug, holding a stuffed horse. He looked up, spotted Eleanor, and called out clearly, "Mama!" Eleanor's heart caught, just as it did every time he said it. "Yes, darling," she said, her voice thick with love. "I am here." The front door creaked open, and a gust of cold air blew in as Caleb stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He shook off the chill and looked across the room. Their eyes met, and he smiled, that quiet, worn smile that had become her favorite sight in the world. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plain brown paper. He crossed the room and handed it to her. "It is not much," he said. Eleanor set her knitting aside and untied the twine. Inside was a folded piece of thick, official paper. She read it once, then again. It was a birth certificate, amended and stamped. Mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Beneath it were 4 names: Thomas, Eli, Martha, Jonah. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb's voice was steady, though his eyes shone. "I cannot give you much, Eleanor. No gold, no name in town that matters. But if I can write your name into the lives of these children, if I can make it real for them, and for you, then I reckon this Christmas will feel whole." Eleanor covered her mouth, the tears coming hot and fast. Behind them the soup boiled over. Thomas rushed to catch it, and the children laughed. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of a life she had once thought impossible. She leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me to get up." And as the snow fell silent and heavy outside, Eleanor knew, finally and completely, that she was home.